Welcome back to Lunaform, a 2D isometric construction management game where you play as a spaceman tasked with terraforming the moon. We currently have a tile map with a spaceman who moves around depending on where the user clicks, with the camera smoothly following. This week I added a spaceship and some larger rocks, as well as getting the gliders set up so that the spaceman doesn't just walk through everything. I also reduced the map size to make it a bit easier to test everything, as well as writing some script to procedurally generate the map to a certain size. This means that the surface features will be randomly placed every time I load the game. Stupidly, I deleted all of the footage of this when I was trying to make space, but these things happen sometimes, so let's move on. He looks a bit funny just sliding around, so it's time to look at some animations. I already have the full Adobe suite, so it was good to discover Adobe Animate. I come from a multimedia background way back from the days of Macromedia Flash, so it was good to have a bit of nostalgia. After a couple of quick tutorials, I found out that much like Flash, you have to break your sprite into different moving parts and animate them separately. After loading up Animate and watching the launch tutorial, I decided to just create a new project, import one of their pre-made moving assets, and just copy the movement for my spaceman. I had some trouble getting the 3D parts of the spaceman to move from Illustrator to Animate. I know you have to render the parts first in Illustrator, which I'm sure I've done before in the past. For whatever reason this time, I just couldn't get it working. I ditched the 3D parts for now in favour of just cracking on with the animations. I'll be redoing all of the sprites throughout the entire build, I'm sure, as I get better at the art side of the game. I also get bored of looking at the same assets for a long time, so I'm anticipating at least 3 changes for each asset over the next month. I think that's what they call iterative design. I created separate symbols for each of the moving parts and set the pivot points to somewhere close to realistic. Next, you have to set the parenting chain between the layers in order to make the forward kinematics work. Kinematics are basically like the bones of the character, which tells the different layers what other layer or body part they are connected to. I discovered I needed to separate the legs and arms further into more parts, which made sense if I wanted the character to bend at the joints. I'm sure you can do this in Animate, but I struggled, so I went back to Illustrator. I spent a bit more time messing with the 3D parts, but still couldn't get them to import to Animate correctly. After creating new symbols for each of the new body parts and setting the parent layers again, I made a few tweaks to some of the body parts to hide the cuts. I did try rig mapping, but I had some pretty crazy results. I think my version of Animate might be broken. Bought in a walking Santa from the Adobe library so I could copy the movements, and after a bit of tweaking, I had a walking spaceman. Next up was the idle animation. After looking at some idle sprites on Google, I found out that idle animations are basically just the character bouncing with their feet on the ground. This seems easy enough. I added some subtle hand movements because I tried to be fancy with it, and I thought you might be excited about just standing still. When I went to export the animation as a sprite sheet, I found that the frames overlapped, so I added a transparent background to force the frames to separate. After importing the sprite sheet into Unity and slicing it to create separate sprites for every frame, I created a new animation within Unity for the Spaceman prefab, using each separate sprite as a new keyframe. You can actually do the animations within Unity itself, but I like the idea of using Animate and sticking with the suite of products I recognise and have used for most of my life. I repeated the same steps for the idle animation and then set up the animator controller, which allows you to set different states for the character using nodes, and then assign the correct animation to the character states. now, we'll just stick with idle and walk. I added the state changes to the Spaceman's movement controller script using some Boolean variables, which allows me to set the walking and idle states to either true or false, meaning that when the Spaceman is idle, the walking state is false, so the walking animation does not play, and vice versa. Before I make any big changes to code, I usually like to copy and paste the working code into a separate document just in case I mess it up. I learnt the hard way that Unity's version control doesn't account for code changes. I know I could set up a Git repository, I just haven't done it yet. I don't know why, I just don't like using Git. I prefer to just lose all my working code every once in a while and then wish I'd set it up. After a few more tweaks, the idle animation was working, but I kept getting the same error every time I tried to make the Spaceman walk somewhere. It turns out I forgot to toggle the Boolean states when switching between animations, and I also forgot to set animator to public. This means I could drag and drop the correct animation into the inspector, making it easier to make changes later. A few more tweaks and we finally had a walking Spaceman. I have a newfound appreciation for animators. The animation sprites will also need to be redone at some point, but the mechanics work at least. That's it for this episode. I'm running about a week ahead of the videos, so I'm pleased to say there are some pretty drastic changes coming in the next episode that I am super excited to share. But for now, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.